Good afternoon and welcome to the Niskanen Center briefing on the November elections, predictions, and preparations. I'm Kodiak Hill-Davis, the Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Niskanen, we are a 5-year-old think tank based in Washington, D.C., and while we are nonpartisan, our policy work focuses on market-based solutions and promoting an open society. Before I introduce today's distinguished speakers, a quick reminder that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we welcome all participants to submit questions throughout the discussion, and then we'll answer those at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce my Niskanen colleagues, Rachel Bitecofer and Geoff Kabaservice. Rachel is a senior fellow, and her work focuses on political behavior and elections. Her innovative election forecasting model predicted the 2018 blue wave 5 months before Election Day. Geoff is the Director of Political Studies, and his work focuses on centrism and moderation. He's a published author many times over, and his work often appears in New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rachel to get our conversation started. Rachel, will you unmute?
I can't look at my own monitor anymore. I have a new setup here for my Election Whisperer show, so I'm set up so I have to look in a really weird direction. So I'm glad to have everyone here to talk about the election. As everyone may know, I have a forecast that came out in July of last year, and I've been updating it occasionally, but just kind of talking about race updates as we go through, and of course, doing running commentary and analysis on Twitter. The show will be debuting on Wednesday too. And although it's not going to be just focused on 2020, it's going to do a lot of updating there too. So today I'm going to be looking at, what has, how the pandemic and of course the response to the George Floyd murders have affected the contours of the race, really exacerbating the problems that Trump was already facing, widening the lead that Biden has held steady. We look at Biden being the name ID frontrunner through the primary. He was able to be polled. I mean, he had really good name saturation. So we've been getting data for Biden for a long time, well before the Democratic primary really, was waged. So we have data that tracks really far back into 2019 on the head-to-head for Trump versus Biden. And so although that has widened out, it's actually been really stable too. Biden's had a significant lead against Trump that's been outside of the margin of error pretty much for the last year, and it's widened out this last few weeks as that race issue has become salient. And what we've seen is actually for the first time since 2016 in October, when the Access Hollywood video was released, when we saw movement of right-leaning independents kind of move away from Trump. And of course, they ended up moving back and voting for him. But for that little bit of period of time, we saw right-leaning independents move away from him. And that's what we're kind of seeing now in that polling data with that Biden lead expanding. But we're also seeing erosion in key constituencies, not in Republican identifiers so much, though we have seen a couple of polls where Republican support has dipped below 90%. We need to see sustained Republican support dipping below 90% for me to say it's a trend, and that's a data point that I'm watching really closely. But when we look at senior citizens, Trump is way underperforming the senior vote from Clinton and his performance with the compared to Clinton in 2016. And Trump is also performing a little bit light than I think he would like to be doing with evangelicals. That's another really important difference, I think, between now and 2016. And I think with the seniors, people are pointing to the pandemic, but the fact is that his data was a little bit soft there heading into it, and the pandemic has only really added to that softness. So I think the effect too of having like a full court press on the messaging, he's not only dealing with an opposition party, but he's dealing with a messaging regime that's coming from outside groups, some of which are coming from some of the best messengers from the old version of the Republican Party. My compatriots there in the Lincoln Project being some great examples of that, really just holding his feet to the fire. So I think what we're generally seeing coming through the spring and into the summer now is a really tough picture for Trump as the race is starting to solidify. And I think Trump is starting to figure out that Biden is just not that easy to foil in terms of like an opponent. Clinton had very easy negatives that could be exploited. Of course, those were articulated negatives that the GOP had very artfully created over a time period, and had a long time to create them, knowing that she would be the front runner in a very, uncontested primary situation with Biden. I think the perception was that he was probably the front runner, but he was a very soft front runner, and he just wasn't as easy to dig up negatives on. And I think that they so far have been unable to articulate a message against him. And in fact, in the rally, although the headlines have been mostly dominant about the poor attendance, which has been great fun for people who are not fans of Trump to exploit, one of probably the more important things that happened at it was not his focus on drinking water or walking down the ramp demonstrations, but actually it was a line that he said that almost nobody has really focused on, but I will be really prominent in campaign ads. And that was that he was talking and musing out loud, as he often does, about Biden. And he was saying, Biden's not like those AOC and Omar people. He's not an extremist like that, and it just like literally undercuts like the one message that they're trying to construct about Biden, which is that he's a closet, ideologue extremist that's going to come and move America to socialism. So I expect, I know that will be making prominent appearances in Lincoln Project ads, but I would expect that the Biden team was literally like, doing somersaults through the living room when they saw him say that, because you just couldn't have asked for better way to undercut the Trump argument about Biden. So anyway, I think like what we're going to probably see if things calm down, and there's no guarantee that they will with Trump and with the way that things are going and the pandemic, now gearing up for, more chaos. The early reopening seems to be working out the way that health officials had warned it might. And we may not see a calming, but if we do see a calming, and once campaign material starts after Labor Day, my expectation, I know that Jen O'Malley Dillon, who is the Biden campaign manager, was just saying this on her podcast interview with David Plouffe, that we would see a narrowing. And that doesn't mean that suddenly Trump has become, more electable and more competitive. It just means that those right-leaning independents have come back home because their partisan preference, like their partisan dispositions get reinforced when they start to get campaign advertising directed at them that reminds them of the policy consequences and of democratic rule, and starts to activate that negative partisanship that my research talks so much about. So, the media will talk about, Trump's regaining steam or whatever they're talking about. But the way that I'll see that as an analyst, and this is probably pretty unique to me as an analyst, is an expected tightening due to that one known and anticipated behavioral feature of independent behavior. So I did make some race changes and updates based on the Democratic Party releasing finally their red to blue target list for the House. And I thought that I would show you those updates and kind of talk through how I walked through that or came up with the race updates. So I'm going to try to also look like I'm looking at the screen and share my screen with you. So let's see. If you followed me on Twitter, you probably never missed this. Can you guys see this, Kodiak? Can you verify?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so in case you don't know, the red to blue list are the districts that the D trip is going to heavily invest in and make a point of trying to flip. They're currently held by Republicans, and so I didn't have which Texas districts the DCCC recognized as competitive when I put out my Texas ratings. I had a suspicion that they probably didn't really articulate or understand which ones would be competitive and which ones wouldn't, and that they would probably be using an old model, which would be previous electoral performance of those districts, which is of course endogenous because it's got, it depends on how much money was invested and who ran in the district in the last election. And so if you haven't been competing there because you don't think it's competitive, then of course it wouldn't be competitive. So what I look for competition in my model is demographics, especially education. And if some place is highly educated and has a decent amount of diversity, then it's hot to trot under this model. And, I thought maybe because of the high performance of candidates who were not top tier recruits by any means. In fact, many of them were not recruited at all. They just ran because somebody had to do it. They had no money, and yet they came very close to 50% in 2018. I thought the Democratic Party would notice, possibly that these were very competitive races across the board. And so I started my Texas ratings kind of all equal, which is lean Republican, because they're all long-term Republican seats that are realigning to the Democratic Party as part of the suburban realignment that we're seeing with college-educated voters moving to the Democrats. And then I wanted to see which ones do the Democrats recognize are competitive. And as it turns out, they've only picked up on about like half, and it's kind of weird to me that they recognize that half of them are and half of them aren't, and that will make more sense to you in a second when we look at the Texas map. So on the red to blue list, I was able to identify that they recognize a couple of races, right? So Texas 21, Texas 22, Texas 3, and Texas 24 are going to attract a lot of investment. A couple of them have really strong, big recruits. Texas 23, of course, was a race that Democrats left on the table in 2018, just barely. And this time, the Republican incumbent, Will Hurd, understanding that he barely survived last time, would not survive a presidential surge turnout, retired strategically. So it's an open seat this time, so it's very, very, very likely to flip. And then they recruited Wendy Davis to run for another seat. So Wendy Davis, if you don't remember, she was the Democrat that ran for governor, didn't have a very great Democratic run, though under my model, there's a reason for that. Obama was president and Democrats weren't getting great turnout overall. It wasn't so much necessarily about her as it was about timing. So like if you took Wendy Davis and made her run in 2018 instead of Beto O'Rourke, probably people would look at her like Beto O'Rourke, right? So anyway, she's running in one of the districts that dip into Austin, and she's getting a lot of attention as well. But they did recognize that a district that's highly urban or suburban and very condensed with a lot of college educated voters, Texas 22, they're going to invest heavily there. They put that on the red to blue list. The candidate there is a diversity candidate too. So he is, they recognize there that district is very competitive, and we're going to take a look at like why it's weird that they can see competition there but not in the Houston area. And then I left Texas 10, 25, and 31 as toss-up, or moved those to toss-up because they're not on the red to blue list. Neither is Texas 2. Texas 2 is actually a reach district. It is not as demographically favorable for Democrats, but it's not without the realm of possibility in a big turnout election, like 70% national turnout, we could see that move into competition. And so I'm going to show you guys the Texas map in a second, but I also wanted to point out I had to add to my forecast like 5 districts that were even on my forecast, and some of these were in like the Cook or the crystal ball, but maybe only one of them, and so I didn't add them to my list because they weren't in all of them. And the reason is that like Arkansas 2, for example, I put that in my 2018 model, and it was it didn't come close to flipping. And this is because these districts are tough. They're more like the traditional competition model for Democrats, and why they've put them on there is because they have. I mean, Montana at large is a little bit of an exception because they're hoping for coattails from the Senate race with Bullock, but the others they're like realigning the other way, or they're just not highly college educated districts, and they have these really well-connected establishment candidates that they think, business Democrats or military Democrats that have these great resumes, and they're just going to overcome like a Republican advantage and they're going to win, right? And so like my model is really more like, okay, it's not the candidate so much as the demographics of the district, though a candidate can make a difference. I mean, if you put somebody like Kelly down in Arizona, who's a terrific candidate, and a state that's realigning red and hot to trot demographically, you're going to get magic to happen, right? So I don't say that candidates don't matter entirely, but you can't make magic happen entirely on a good candidate. It's not good to do that. So I had to actually add these districts to my forecast. That's because the Democrats are going to jump, $10-12 million into these races, basically rowing a boat upriver against a current, where they could go back up here and invest in these Texas races that this map will kind of show you are, would be really attractive races for them if they recognized competition. Because, here's Wendy Davis's race, the 21st. And this is basically going to make or break the race, the tail that goes into the city of Austin, which of course this is the most famous gerrymander, by the way, in the whole country. It's the Austin Cracked District. It has it's the only major metro area in the entire country that has no what we call anchor district. So there's no like major district that anchors the city. It's divided into 5 districts, one of which is a Democrat, and the rest of them are all controlled by Republicans. Because they hated the Austin Democrats so much in the Texas legislature that's what they did to pay them back 10 years ago in their reapportionment. They cracked Austin into 5 pieces. So anyway, she's trying to pick up enough here, and they recognized over here though that Sarai's district in the 22nd had so much condensement of college educated voters. We're looking at, let's see, 42% non-white population and a 51% college educated population in the suburban district. That, that's my model's like loves this, right? That's what my model in 2018 looked at all across the country and said Democrats are just gonna like whop the Republicans everywhere that looks like this. And then, when we get up here though, in the third is even more, it's just like 60% college educated, and the 24th, same story, 51%. And the Democrats don't see, they're going to go drop money in Arkansas too. So that told me like a lot about what's going on in the brain trust of the Democratic Party. And, same as it ever was, right? So that was my update in the House, and I haven't really updated much in the Senate except for I did move Iowa as a toss-up a while back. I don't know if that was in the last webinar. South Carolina is starting to look like something that the Republicans are at least going to have to spend money on. So that's pretty stunning.
Well, thank you so much for that update, Rachel. And now I'm going to turn it over to Geoff for some remarks, and then we'll move on to Q&A at the end.
Thanks very much to everyone for joining us. Thanks for your presentation, Rachel. Thank you for moderating Kodiak. I don't know how you all are doing. I'm having a hard time with quarantine just psychologically, because it seems like every week is basically a year, and I can't even remember what it was like back in March. But anyway, it's kind of interesting as someone who was trained as a historian, because, I am not sort of steeped in the literature of contemporary political analysis, but I do have a sense that, as we used to say in the historical profession, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And you can tell something about the study of the present from what you have learned by your study of the past. And I got to say, this election is starting to feel sort of like a 1964 Barry Goldwater wipeout. It wouldn't be on that scale, of course, because simply of the way that partisan allegiances work nowadays. But the thing that's notable about the Barry Goldwater election in 1964 was it wasn't just that Goldwater lost in a landslide to the Democratic candidate Lyndon Johnson. It was that Goldwater also dragged down virtually every other Republican running in almost no matter what capacity. So it was really a bloodbath for Republicans in the House. It was bad in the Senate. It was bad at the gubernatorial races. It was bad in terms of state legislature races. And it sort of remains to be seen how this election is going to go, but there are some of those ominous signs up and down the ticket for Republicans as well. I'm sure some of you tuned in, or at least heard about Trump's attempted rally in Tulsa. And there's that vivid quote in the New York Times account of Trump and his advisors looking with horror at these vast banks of blue empty seats in the Bank of Oklahoma center there. And this was something where they had at least said that there were 1 million tickets sold. Maybe it was TikTok teens who helped inflate that figure. But at any rate, it just was a really bad thing for the Republican Party. For Trump, it's maybe Trump psychologically. It certainly does seem like the Lincoln Project has rented space inside his head. Various people have come up with different countings, but it appeared that Trump spent either 14 or 16 minutes talking about Rampgate. This is like the Lincoln Project's attempt to call his health into question based on his navigating a ramp at his West Point speech last week. And I think what the campaign also revealed is that Trump really doesn't have a campaign theme as yet. He doesn't really seem to have an articulated message for why he wants re-election, compared to a fairly clear sense of purpose that he articulated in 2016. And that's going to cause further problems for Republicans down the ticket, I suspect. In terms of what the Republican Party is dealing with as well, this is maybe somewhat orthogonal to Rachel's analysis, but it seems to me that I've been seeing enough separate accounts that share common themes about the difficulty that electable Republicans, never mind moderate Republicans, are going to have trouble taking back power in the party in a number of areas. Let me point you to one article that came out last week from Niskanen senior fellow Chris Vance. He used to be head of the Washington State Republican Party and knows a lot about practical politics on the ground. And he wrote an article for Crosscut magazine, which in effect says, forget about Republicans winning the Washington State gubernatorial race. They don't have a serious candidate for the first time in living memory. And this is a state, generally speaking, where if you have going to have any chance at statewide election, the Republican Party has followed this pattern in the past. They'll put up someone who is fairly moderate. They'll put up someone who is from King County, which is where Seattle is located. They'll put up someone who can speak to middle-class, college-educated, suburban concerns on education, on the environment. And they will get lots of their support from the business community, and particularly big business in the past, certainly Boeing, which was headquartered in Seattle. And this year, none of that is happening. Washington had been a state that had been trending blue for quite some time. And now there are 4 candidates for the governor, and all of them are sort of Trump model, anti-establishment, anti-intellectual, flamboyant, populist conservatives. And not one of them has a chance. And at this point, they have raised only about a third as much money, any candidate, as did the previous Republican nominee who lost in the last attempt at the governor's race. And what's going on here actually seems pretty similar to something that we've seen happen in Oregon, where Jo Ray Perkins is the nominee for the Republican Party for the US Senate. This is an outright QAnon conspiracist. She literally believes that a cabal of Democrats and elites run a pedophilic cannibal ring, and that Trump is imminently to arrest Hillary Clinton, perhaps Barack Obama, and possibly execute them. So this is the kind of fevered nonsense that actually passes for political analysis now in certain precincts of the Republican Party. And this only happens when the party has kind of lost hope of winning, that it would nominate someone this outlandish. And the state party is actually backing this crazy person, and this is going to further discredit the party in that state as well, if not nationally. And apparently this is only one of several QAnon backing Republicans who are out there likely to at least be the nominee of the party, if not necessarily the victor. But in the Georgia 14th district, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene has been recently been revealed to be not just a QAnon backer, but also someone who has made a long habit of posting racist, inflammatory addresses on her Facebook page. So anyway, this is not a good thing for the party. And then maybe even more indicative of some of the dynamic going on was Denver Riggleman, who is the sitting congressman in Virginia's 5th district, which is a big, mostly rural district that extends way up as close as the Washington, D.C. border. It's a heavily gerrymandered district. And it's a district that actually went Democratic as recently as 2008. Tom Perriello represented it for a term. And Denver Riggleman, who's the current occupant of that office, was somebody who is, and always has been, not a moderate. He's conservative. He has a pretty high level of Trump support, as tracked by 538.com and other. It's like that. But his crime in the views of the most conservative activists in that district was that he officiated at a gay wedding of 2 of his supporters and friends, against him, and he lost in the party convention to this minister activist, and the convention just happened to take place in the parking lot of this challenger's church. Oh, sorry about that. Am I back?
Yep.
Okay. Rachel had everybody said to me, what will the outcome be in this district, Virginia's 5th? But what seems clear is that the Republican Party at least is going to have to put money into that district to defend what otherwise would have been a fairly easy re-election. And Jonathan V. Last, in his column in the Bulwark newsletter, made an interesting point about a week ago, which is that for a number of Republican areas, places like this, the goal is no longer even necessarily victory. The goal is purity, as it always has been, but the Republican Party is no longer operating as it has throughout history as a vote maximizing organism that will adjust depending on the market in order to pursue a set of ideological goals. At this point, the Republican Party has abandoned much of what distinguished it ideologically. And now it is really much more like a therapy session where people get together and feel aggrieved at their enemies and the state of the world. And in some ways, maybe this is even better than winning elections, because winning, number one, is hard. And once you're in office, you have to actually put policies forward and defend them and build coalitions and defend your record or lack thereof. But if you actually are losing, then this kind of makes you feel even more of a martyr. And it means that you don't actually have to really address anything. It's the mark of an unserious party. And this is something that, you know, it's going to be one hates to overuse the metaphor, a civil war, but there's definitely going to be a struggle in the future between Republicans who simply want to win, Republicans who also want to see some of what the party has stood for actually get in a position to actually make some of these things happen in office. And one of the things that Chris Vance pointed out in his Crosscut article that I thought was very significant was that the Republican Party, when it wins, typically gets most of its donations from business. Right now in Washington State, those donations are coming almost exclusively from individuals, highly motivated activists, but people who actually don't really have any kind of real basis of support or resources. So anyway, this all bodes rather poorly for the Republican Party, both in this election in 2020 and then perhaps even for a time afterwards. But I will mostly leave the crystal ball speculation to Rachel. So let's move back to Kodiak.
I've said it before, but it bears repeating. It is an absolute pleasure to be able to work with people like Rachel and with Geoff. So thoughtful. The analysis and the framework that you both provided is a great way to kind of start the next phase of our conversation. And I think we're going to have some great questions and some great discussion. But just a quick thought, and it follows on to something that both Geoff and Rachel highlighted, is that one of the unique aspects of this election cycle is that candidates have really struggled to figure out, Republican candidates have really struggled to figure out how to ride the coattails of a president who is a sitting president who is very popular with his base, but is also very polarizing. So you have this interesting conundrum where you don't know how to maintain the appropriate amount of distance based on your district, or embrace him based on your district. So you're caught in this kind of in between. And certainly the tumultuous events of the last 3 months, I think, have been very challenging for those candidates to figure out how to thread the needle in talking about a sitting president who is both extraordinarily popular and durable with his base, but also very polarizing for anyone who isn't kind of bought in. So that's certainly something that we've all been paying attention to and watching quite closely, and it's a sticky wicket there. So we already have some questions rolling in, and I think in the past what we've done is I've read the questions and posed them back to our panelists. It's the best part of this job. I get to pass on the hard questions and take the low-hanging fruit for myself. So I will get started. And this one looks like it involves math, so I'm definitely glad I'm not answering it. What is the probability that the Democrats take the Senate? And I think Rachel can take this one.
Getting better every day. I mean, I think when I dropped the forecast update in March, it was 50-50. And today, if I had to say, I think it's probably getting closer to 70-30. And so like the probability, the way to scope that out, I think that's easiest is where is the GOP forced to spend and how much. And if they're spending a ton of money in Georgia and Iowa and money in South Carolina, that's that. I mean, because they only need, keep in mind that 3 seats are pretty much in the bucket. They've got the 3 that they need in Colorado, Maine, and Arizona. And then they need that 4th pivot seat because of the Doug Jones seat in Alabama probably flipping back. Otherwise, those 3 are good enough, right? If that Alabama seat could stay in Democratic hands. And I mean, the pandemic doesn't make that impossible, but it's a long shot. So I think Democrats are operating on the modus operandus that they need 4. So you have 3 basically in the hole, and then you have a pathway of 6 seats, 6 ways to get there. That's a lot of backstop you have to cover. So I think the way to gauge the probability is, if the GOP is fiercely defending, being forced to fiercely defend Kansas because Kobach ends up being the nominee, and if this Denver Riggleman thing is any indication, then he probably is going to be. If they're forced to defend heavily, to defend Mitch down there in Kentucky, and Lindsey in South Carolina, and that's where they're spending money, then that means those frontline seats, Montana, Arizona, Montana, and oh my gosh, what's the other one that's North Carolina, really likely to pop, are very likely. So I think we're really looking at 70-30 right now.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And I guess also in this cycle, it's worth noting too that Republicans have more Senate seats up. I think you mentioned that, Rachel, than
yeah. I mean, if Trump had filled that Tulsa rally, and there had been an overflow crowd and 10, 20,000 people outside of it, like I was expecting, but that didn't happen. And yes, I think that the psychological warfare aspect of like the TikTok teenagers probably played a role, because like I said, I mean, being an older, physically impaired person, if an event is going to be super physically hard to access, it's a deterrent for sure. But at the end of the day, I think like the fact of the matter is people are not willing to go die to go see Donald Trump in a rally, right? Who'd have thought? I thought that they would be, I mean, as of that morning when the lines started, 4 days early and people were camping in chairs for 4 days, and then people showed up, but actually they weren't. And so like, that's a big tell right there, like, so yeah, 70-30.
Wow. All right, I'll move on to our next question, which is also for you, Rachel. Can you tell us about the 8 Senate seats that are possible red to blue? Particularly, I'd like to know about North Carolina and Kentucky. Well, luckily, you just touched on those. And Kentucky's primary is tomorrow, actually.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think that Kentucky primaries and I really like to talk about it in tandem with the New York 14 primary, because there's statewide, because we really have the same situation, right? I think Amy McGrath expected to walk into that Kentucky nomination, and now she's fighting it out against not only a progressive challenger to that nomination, but an African-American progressive, right? And the same situation's going up in New York 14, but the difference is McGrath has the benefit of a statewide electorate to help her, and that New York 14 is an urban district, right? So it's very, very liberal. When AOC came in and swooped in and surprised the Democratic Party, surprise was a key element, number one, and number two, like the turnout was low because it was a midterm primary. And in this case, like the New York Democratic primary, it's a presidential primary, so the turnout will be higher. That's an advantage for Engel. But, you know, again, the electorate is going to be very liberal. The moment really is powerful for candidates of color. So, you know, Engel's in trouble, and it's really I think, here's the thing, like we've got these two all-star cast of endorsers, you know, AOC, Sanders, Warren on one side, and then Hillary Clinton and Adam Schiff and like all these heavy hitters on Engel's side. But I think it's going to be like who understands like the purpose of an endorser is to get people to pay attention to the primary and show up. You know, and to me, like the progressive side probably understands that a little bit better. So we'll see on that one. But the down in Kentucky, like only having one polling location in the most heavily, it's 600,000 voters using one polling location, and you know that's not, yeah, it's that half of the Black voters in the state of Kentucky will be using one polling location in that primary. So that probably is not a good asset. And plus, like when turnout surges in a state in this environment, that turnout surge is coming from college educated voters. And those voters are surging, like usually people who do primaries are more ideologically driven, more party oriented people. And where we're seeing turnout increases, I mean, although it's coming from all aspects of the electorate from the Trump effect, like we're really seeing it from people who are more moderate, who don't tend to vote in primaries, but they're activated because of Trump. And that's what saved Joe Biden and the Democrats, right, in South Carolina and all those Super Tuesday states, was that big turnout effect of more independents, more moderates. So I think McGrath has probably got the edge there in Kentucky, but that New York 14 is going to be one to watch.
Thank you. Okay, another question for you, Rachel. Geoff, I swear we will find some for you as well. We will get you back into this conversation. Rachel, do you have any sense that the Democratic Party might learn from your methods and listen to you, or any sense of why they're so stuck with their old strategies? And may I just say before Rachel starts that turning a party is like turning a cruise ship. It is not the whiplash that you see in the media. It takes a long time to strategically realign your thinking.
Yeah, because like the reason I've had so much like success teaming up with the Lincoln Project boys is that they have their party lists, right? Like they're little orphans, you know. So you know, yes, it's a titanic you know, and I've had a lot of contacts from like you know, a lot of people. So I wouldn't say that I've had no success in getting people to pay attention to my research. I know a lot of people, it's impacted a lot of people doing a lot of things, you know, and a lot of races, like the Wisconsin State Supreme Court race up in Wisconsin, and so on and so forth. So it's not like the party's completely blind to it. But like I said, when that red to blue list came out, I knew it wasn't like, you know, the head of the D trip sat down and was like, okay, we used to do it this way, but Rachel Bitecofer says we should do it that way, and we're going to do it this way from now on, right? And I mean, you know, a lot of it comes down to, like, you know, there's this nexus of smart, like, people, and that other people have worked with for years, and that's like, it's a circle of trust, right? And like, you don't just get into the circle of trust. You know, I think that's unfortunate. I mean, I just want to be careful here, you know, because I think like there's a lot of money too involved, you know, there's a lot of money and status quo, like situations involved too. And like, you know, there's a lot of motivation not to change things too, because changing things might upset profit margins and the way things are done and who's getting contracts and who's not. So, you know, but I personally think that it's just difficult for people to try new things too. If you're used to looking at a square and someone's like, no, dude, it's a triangle, and you're like, no, it's a square, right? Yeah, but it's a triangle. It can be hard to get somebody to see it as a triangle.
Certainly, and I think during the 2016 cycle, I think a lot of the kind of old establishment, this is how we think about elections, this is how things are going to go. A lot of that got caught very flat-footed with
Yes.
the Trump election. So
and I do try, like, that's why I keep trying to bring that back. I'm like, that's why on 2016 on election night, you guys were all like, oh. Because, you know, like, it's not that those things were always wrong. Like, those things were right, but the time period has changed. And like the electorate has changed, and because people get used to hearing something. So polarization, like, people think it's just a buzzword, but it's an empirical, measurable behavioral trait in elites, in the courts, in presidency, in the public, right? And it's had these measurable impacts on behavior. So all I'm trying to get people to understand, it's not that like the Clinton model was wrong in 92. It was totally right. It's just not right in 2016, and it's not going to be right in 2020.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. I love following your information. Thank you so much. That's so nice. We're glad to follow information for participating today. So the question goes, like many voters, we have a limited but not insignificant amount to donate to the election. In 2016, Sam Wang of Princeton gave a specific allocation of close races. Is there any chance that you might do the same? For me, it would be ideal if that allocation included get out the vote groups or super PACs, so if that makes sense. And of course, Niskanen Center is a 501c3. So we do not weigh in that sense.
Right.
But I'm sure there are organizations who are looking at the forecast that Rachel has done and taking those into consideration, and are probably working on some get out the vote efforts. But Niskanen Center, I don't believe, will be getting involved in any sort of recommendations in any way.
No, that's right. You know, but on my show, I'll be talking with lots of groups that do lots of things like that, and people who watch the show will learn about them.
Rachel, can you, because this is just a great opening, can you explain where your show will be so that maybe some of the participants can find it?
Yeah, so my show premieres on Wednesday on YouTube. On that particular show, the premiere is at 6 p.m. And right after, I'm going to do a live chat, question and answer like this. So I'm really excited about that. And then after that, it will premiere a new episode every week on Wednesdays. This first episode is going to be about the Veep stakes, and I'm bringing on my buddy from Crystal Ball, Kyle Kondik, to have a nerd fest convo about vice presidential picks. And we're also going to do, I've been soliciting questions from people for the first episode. So I'll be answering about a bunch of questions from the mailbox and talking about future episodes. I'm so excited about how many people have stepped up to do some really great topics. We're going to be looking at how, I've got an episode. The second episode has Rick Wilson, and Rick does TV all the time. People know Rick. He's the brains behind the Lincoln Project ads. But he doesn't usually get to do TV and talk about what I'm bringing him on to talk about, which is, how I call it the lean, mean GOP campaign machine, which is how the GOP does electioneering, which is distinct from how Democrats do it. So he's going to take us behind the nuts and the bolts of GOP campaigning and how it's just master chess. So it's going to be great, and really get into some of these topics that never get any airtime. It's going to be a great show for policy wonks, but election wonks. Anybody who's a political wonk will love it.
Great. I'm really looking forward to that episode this week.
Yep.
All right, here's our next question. sorry if you mentioned this, what do you think of the 7th District of Texas? It's a previously held GOP seat that Lizzie Fletcher won in 2018, and it's actually a pretty competitive district.
Yeah. So like one thing to point out on my ratings, like there's the 40 seats the Democrats picked up in 18, and almost all of them are rated as seats I expect them to pick in this to hold on to in this cycle. But that's under an assumption of massive amounts of money invested in them to hold on to them, and grassroots and a full court press from Democrats. So when I mark it like as a safe seat, that's under the assumption that it's defended ferociously.
Great. Okay. How do you factor in the potential for states to restrict registration, constrain voting, or other external influences? And this is actually something that Geoff and I have been working on, the promotion of election security and the need for federal funding for election infrastructure as states are trying to address the COVID crisis and the new kind of constraints on their ability to execute fair, legitimate, and safe elections. These states are now confronting issues like having PPE. The poll workers tend to be older,
right.
In a higher risk demographic. So there's a lot of conversation about different voting modalities and different ways that states can address these kind of problems of adapting in a very strange and uncertain time, while understanding, of course, that public perception that the election has been legitimate, safe, and accessible is all critically important. So Geoff, if you have additional thoughts, welcome to hear them.
Thanks, Kodiak. I'd just repeat what you're saying there. Everyone on some level knows that this could be a real problem if either there's a second wave of the coronavirus in the fall, or if the first wave has not receded, as frankly it hasn't so far. And a number of states have attempted to revise their voting rules to make it easier for people to cast no excuse absentee ballots. But there are still some states where the rules are really quite strict in terms of who gets to cast an absentee ballot. And we've seen from a number of other places, fairly recently, most recently Georgia, I think, and we will be seeing this in Kentucky, states simply aren't prepared to deal with the realities of conducting an election during the coronavirus. And, I think things could be quite bad. Again, if you were to ask the average person on the street if he or she is anticipating staying up on election night, waiting to see who's nominated, they would say, sure, I always do. That's not going to happen this year. It's almost certain to be the case that no one is going to know with any definitude as to who actually won the election on election night. It may take weeks until we actually have had all of the states report their absentee ballots and counted them and sent them on. And this is even aside from the likelihood, again, that Trump and a lot of other people who are in his circle may make mischief over this election, particularly if Trump thinks that he's going to lose. Already you can tell one of his responses when he came back from the disappointing Tulsa rally was to send out a tweet suggesting that foreign governments are going to be printing out millions of fake absentee ballots. And what will happen if the president is determined to have lost and won't vacate the White House and claims that the election was a fraud and therefore he should stay on for however long he needs to? We don't know. We've never been in this territory before.
That's right.
But I think it's fairly significant that a number of military leaders have been coming out lately saying about their fidelity to the Constitution and the need to follow its procedures. And this suggests which side of that argument they will fall on. Cheery stuff.
It really is. It's a great reminder that we're really living through some significant historical events, and that it's important. This election is important. All elections are important, but this one in particular, I think, has some real consequences for the next phase of American life and what that looks like.
If you've ever read a history book and wish you were there, well, welcome aboard.
It's true. I think someone put it very well when they said that we are basically living through a social studies chapter, and we are just all trying to do the best that we can. All right, so this question dovetails nicely with the previous question. How are candidates changing their tactics, if at all, because of the large increase in vote by mail? And it's a great question. You know, campaigns can't go door knocking. They can't do the kind of public visibility and engagement exercises that they typically would be doing at this point in the campaign cycle. So I know that those campaigns are certainly having to try to find ways to be relevant, to be seen as engaging in the community without physically being able to do so. Rachel, do you have some thoughts about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I know. I think one of the models that's really attractive to people is it's like a peer-to-peer model where you reach out to highly engaged regular voters that are clearly on your party side, and then you turn them into recruiters, right? And they recruit people to go vote, and they recruit other people to be recruiters, and then you spread it out from there, which is actually, by the way, a really great model for low resourced campaigns that can't afford door knockers, because that door knocking, especially for Democrats, because they have to pay that $15 minimum wage, can be really expensive, right? So this peer-to-peer model can be a cheap alternative to that, and also possibly quite efficient, right? So you get these people to recruit 10 people and then recruit more recruiters, and so it's like kind of like a non-evil pyramid scam, right? Because you're not actually like enlisting people to sell products and sell their soul. So I think that's one way to do it, because then they can they're using their personal networks, so they could use their cell phone, they don't have to leave their house, and then of course they stay in contact with the people they recruit through the summer and fall and make sure that they show up to vote, right? I think a lot more reliance on electronic communication. But yeah, I think that there's also a lot of pressure, right? So I think if you know the opposition party is going to continue to use door knocking, then you're going to put yourself at a competitive disadvantage to not do it. So, and when we think about who does volunteer for campaigns, it is disproportionately, just like with poll workers, older people. So I really feel like, there's a call to arms for people under the age of 40, under the age of 30 in two areas for this cycle, both in the campaign volunteer capacity, in terms of contact type of campaign work, and in terms of poll workers. Because, in Wisconsin, they only had 6 polling locations open out of 180. And it was the legitimate reason that they don't have poll workers. They can't open the polling locations. And in the fall, that will be true. All across the city areas in particular, there will be inadequate polling locations open, and vote by mail is a very convenient voting option. But, I can see where socioeconomically disadvantaged people or people who don't speak English won't be able to utilize those. So I don't think the Democrats would be wise to rely on vote by mail and just, let the poll working problem be neglected. I think poll working is like, if I was on the organizing side, I think I would be raising a red flag of danger, orange flag of danger. We must be able to staff these polling locations in every major metro polling location, because, people think about Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and they think about what working class voters. I don't. I think about suburban and metro areas, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee. Those places will make or break Biden.
Thank you, Rachel. Our final question, and we have about 6 minutes left, so we should have plenty of time to answer this. Given the Democrats need to appeal both to college-educated suburban voters and to further left-leaning millennial Gen Z voters to secure victory in 2020, what VP candidate would you recommend that the Biden team select if you could? And I think, Rachel, you should certainly take this, and Geoff, feel free to weigh in as well.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely save time for you, Geoff. And I can be quicker because I have that New York Times piece that I think I make a pretty strong case, and that was published on Tuesday. I think the George Floyd murder had occurred, but the backlash was just beginning. And I think that the case for a candidate of color has just And I think Amy Klobuchar, made this point too when obviously she had political reasons to do what she did, but I do think listening to her on that Lawrence O'Donnell show as she made her announcement, I think, was genuinely making the point that this is a moment that you can't ignore. The issue of racial injustice, it's very rare to see a social movement emerge with this type of momentum. When you look at the annals of American history, we're talking about leaps of 30, 40 years when you see something like we're living through right now and have seen the last few weeks. If the Biden team is too blind to notice it, I would be shocked. So I'm assuming that they will be looking for a female African-American or Black running mate. And I think Kamala Harris is probably going to be the one.
Let me just weigh in here in my capacity as the House Devil's Advocate. I am pressed to think of an occasion in which the vice presidential selection made a big difference to the ticket's outcome. Most people don't really base their votes on that. I do think it's significant that to the extent that Trump previewed any kind of strategy at his rally in Tulsa, it was that he's going to double down on the kind of racialized culture war rhetoric that helped him win the election in 2016. But Rachel is correct. People's attitudes have changed a lot in a fairly short amount of time. I have an Economist magazine from just 3 weeks ago that said Black Lives Matter. It's kind of lost steam. No one really talks about it anymore. The label turns a lot of people off. Well, now that's actually not the case. However, let me also say this, that I think that this is still in many ways a center-right country, and that revolutions tend to exceed their mandate, as it were. And you're already seeing a lot of the seeds of a potential backlash being sown right now with various kinds of left-wing excesses that we need not necessarily get into right here. I am sure the Biden campaign is considering a woman of color as its nominee. I think Harris is actually the person who I wish I'd actually put money on back in fall of last year when I predicted the ticket would be Biden-Harris. However, one also hears a lot of enthusiasm for Stacey Abrams' campaign, and I think that might well be received differently by some of the people that the Biden campaign knows it must win over. Again, the problem with sort of predicating the whole Democratic strategy on the idea that it needs to win over its left wing tends to ignore the fact that a lot of those voters are concentrated in areas where there are already an awful lot of them. Whereas, in fact, what the Democrats need to do is not win the popular vote, but to win the Electoral College. It is entirely possible that Trump could lose the popular vote by as much as 5 million votes and still win the election, based on narrow outcomes in critical states like, as happened last time around, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. So I would hope the Biden campaign is at least considering that possibility as well.
I'm going to close by saying by recounting what I was told to a high-ranking and current, like Republican, not current official, but current high-ranking Republican at an event I also can't name, who did, as Geoff just said, point out that Democrats need to make sure that they appeal to the middle to win the Midwest, and then went on to talk about how great Pence is at getting the Republican base excited to vote. And it prompted me to say to him, it's so weird to me that even though Republicans, are the least populated party category in the country, that, they should always use these base motivating vice presidential picks, but Democrats, who are the, more populated people, need these vice presidential picks to appeal to the other party. So it's a curious strategy. I actually do think that vice presidential picks have begun to matter because in the polarized era, when you have this ideological factionalization and you've got these unsettled, factions within your party, as with the Pence pick, a pick that at least is not a moderate, which of course, Biden is like the quintessential moderate, would be a wise olive branch.
Well, thank you so much to Rachel and Geoff for your thoughtful insight and this great conversation about our predictions for the November 2020 cycle. So thank you for everyone who participated today. There will be a recording of this made available through the niskanancenter.org website. And we encourage you, if you had further questions or we didn't get to something, please feel free to reach out. Our contact information, again, is available on the Niskanen Center website. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.